They had reported the illegal timber trafficking to the police. But ever since that day, Hung could feel eyes watching him, cold, calculated, dangerous. Revenge was in the air. The moment he left the meeting with the private detective, Hung didn't drive back to the city. He went straight to the mountains, to the one person he could trust, without a doubt, Tieu. About the betrayal, the forged contracts, the smugglers, the detective's findings, the risks, the threat hanging over his life and company, like a sword ready to fall. Tieu listened silently, her face pale, hands tightening around the cloth she had been folding. When he finished, she looked into his eyes and asked simply, "What will you do now?" Hung inhaled deeply, voice shaking yet firm. "I can't let them go unpunished. They almost destroyed everything I built. But I can't fight this alone. It's too dangerous. I think we need to go to the police." There was no hesitation in her eyes. "Yes," she said quietly. "Let the law handle it. No matter how hard it gets, we will face it together." The next morning, they traveled to the nearest police station. Hung submitted every document, every piece of evidence, gathered names, locations, transactions. What started as a business betrayal had become an international smuggling investigation. The criminal unit moved swiftly. Undercover detectives watched the suspects day and night. The network was deeper, dirtier than anyone imagined. After weeks of tireless pursuit, in the silence of a cold night, arrest warrants were issued. A surprise raid unfolded. The man who had deceived Hung, along with several ringleaders, were arrested. The news broke across the region. Hung and Tieu, cut two names once unknown to the world, became symbols of courage and justice. But peace didn't come easily. The company had suffered. Financial losses were heavy. Though his reputation was cleared, Hung bore emotional scars too deep for words. He became quieter, more cautious, more reflective. And then, something else changed. Mr. Nguyen, Hung's father, powerful man, known for his rigid views, began to soften. He had always disapproved of Tieu. To him, she was a poor mountain woman with 2 children, unworthy of his son. But now, watching Hung slowly rebuild from ruin, Mr. Nguyen saw something different: strength, maturity, resilience, and behind it all Tieu. She never asked for anything, never demanded attention, but she stayed. She stood by, Hung like a quiet mountain, wind-steady and unwavering. Though Mr. Nguyen never said it aloud, his silence grew less harsh. His eyes held something almost like respect. Hung worked hard, often through the night, determined to rebuild what was lost. He found honest partners, strengthened security protocols, and made it clear, trust must be earned, not assumed. Meanwhile, Tieu circus life blossomed. She expanded her garden, raised poultry for income, and even began making local mountain delicacies to sell to tourists. She worked with her hands, and with love. Her little thatched house began to bloom, not with wealth, but with peace. Her children, Annie and her baby brother, filled the home with laughter. They adored Hung, running into his arms every time he visited. And though he never said it, Hung loved them too. Yet he kept a respectful distance. He didn't want to ruin what was healing. Not until he was sure. Not until he was ready to ask a question that had lived in his heart for too long. One afternoon, he came to her with wildflowers in hand. Simple, bright, just like her. He sat beside her, watching the mountains breathe under the setting sun. Then, in a voice low and warm, he said, "I know you've been through so much. I know I should have been here for you sooner. But I see you now, fully. I see your strength, your kindness, your laughter even after all the pain." He turned to face her. "I love you, Lai Tayuka. I love how you care for the children. I love your courage. Please, let me stay. Let me be the one to stand beside you, to care for you and them, not just today, but every day." Her breath caught. Tears filled her eyes. For a moment, words escaped her. But she nodded just once. That was enough. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if letting go would mean losing her forever. And in that quiet mountain evening, a new chapter began, one rooted in truth, trust, and enduring love. Their wedding was simple, held at the foot of the mountain, surrounded by a handful of close friends, family, and nature itself. It wasn't the lavish celebration of a rich man's son, but it was more than enough. It was real. Even Mr. Nguyen came. He stood quietly in the back, watching his son marry a woman who once had nothing, and yet gave everything. From that day on, the mountain wind carried not just the scent of pine, but also the memory of a love that refused to be broken, a love that rose from the ashes and dared to bloom again. The wind was gentler these days. Hung often said the mountain air felt lighter, as if the forest itself had breathed a sigh of relief after all they'd been through. The small house at the edge of the forest had become more than a shelter. It was home. A real home, filled with warmth, scent of freshly cooked rice, the laughter of children, and the sound of Lai Tieu Circa's soft humming as she stirred soup or fed the chickens. It had been 3 months since their wedding. 3 months of peace, of healing, of gentle beginnings. And then, one morning, Lai Tayuka awoke with a strange flutter in her chest. The sunlight streamed in through the bamboo blinds, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. She lay still for a long time, her hand resting just below her stomach. Something felt different. She brushed the thought away at first. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she'd worked too hard in the garden yesterday. But as the days passed, her body whispered to her again. The nausea in the mornings, the softness in her gaze, the quiet joy she couldn't explain. Hung noticed too. "You've been glowing lately," he said one evening, wrapping his arms around her as she chopped vegetables. "You're tired, but you smile more." She turned to him, eyes searching his. Her voice was barely more than a breath. "I think I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world went completely silent. Even the birds outside seemed to pause. Hung stared at her, stunned. Then slowly, his lips curled into the widest smile she had ever seen. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her hands, over and over again. "A baby," he whispered, voice shaking with wonder. "Our baby." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Hung dropped to his knees, his hands resting gently on her belly, and said, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a family." The weeks that followed were filled with tender care. Hung insisted on doing more chores, though his cooking was questionable, and his attempts at hanging laundry often ended in tangled messes. Lai Tayuka laughed often, and even more than before, she began to believe in something she never dared to before, a future that was truly hers. Annie was the first to start calling Hung Dad one evening without thinking. Her voice was casual, her little fingers sticky with rice. Hung froze, his eyes misting, then smiled like the sun had broken through a storm. "Dad, can we plant more flowers tomorrow?" "Yes," he said, heart full. "As many as you want." But life, as always, wasn't done testing them. One evening, Mr. Nguyen visited. He came quietly, bringing with him a bundle of cloth and dried medicine roots from a trusted physician. "I heard the news," he said awkwardly, his voice not quite meeting Hung's eyes. Tieu stood nearby, unsure what to say. Mr. Nguyen placed the bundle gently into her hands. For the child, there was no grand speech, no apology. Just a look, soft, honest, tired. That night, Hung sat beside his father by the fire, just like when he was a boy. "You're not disappointed?" Hung asked. Mr. Nguyen stared into the flames. "Disappointed? No. She made you into a man I respect. Then, after a pause, she will be part of our family. Not because of obligation, but because she belongs." It was the closest thing to acceptance Hung had ever hoped for. As the months passed, Tieu's belly grew, round and full like the moon. The villagers came by with herbs and lullabies. Hung built a new cradle out of rosewood, sanding it by hand every night until it gleamed. The children painted it with flowers and stars. And one quiet dawn, as the mist kissed the trees and the first birds began to sing, their baby was born. A boy, small but strong, with Hung's eyes and Tieu's peaceful expression. They named him Hope or Hai Ven in the old language because that's what he was. A symbol of everything they had overcome. Epilogue of this chapter. In the mountains, life moved slowly. But for Hung and Tieu, it moved with meaning. Each day, they woke with gratitude. They tended the garden, raised the children, and sat beneath the stars in the evenings, hands entwined. Not every moment was easy, but love quiet, resilient, and real was always there. They had weathered betrayal, judgment, and fear. And now, with their children's laughter echoing through the trees and a new baby in their arms, they knew they had finally found peace.